Well, I can start talking just a little bit as people come in. A lot of what I might ramble about might not be just kind of generally saying welcome. So this program is part of our adult summer reading program, which we entitle Exploring Perspectives. And while we were planning it this spring, we were, of course, more in a COVID mode where all programming was planned for Zoom, and we all got used to that. So I'm glad it still works because, of course, in this case, we can reach out to some people who are not in our 55082 zip code or part of our regular library program. But I certainly feel like the more programs the library can offer and any of us can attend that are just generally informational, and we are learning things and we're able to discuss things as a community, that's a bonus. And that's what all kinds of programs should be about, and certainly what the library is about. So we're happy to welcome all of you.
I guess Sarah started.
So I just have
Somebody, is it Sandy Larson? It looks like you're.
all these women heard all of their stories.
Might need to mute. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I will say, personally, I'm all things climate, and that's a deep personal interest of mine, but it might be a new first to have actually suggested that my own daughter do a program in the library. And that's, I'll come up front and say our presenter tonight is my daughter, Laura. Very proud to have her here. And it came about during the time in the spring when we were discussing the Texas outages. And I mentioned to my peers that it was interesting to get Laura's take on what all that was about. And we weren't nimble enough to have a program like 2 weeks later or 1 week later when everyone might have been interested, but we did sort of tuck it away as an option. So that's sort of how it's materialized. And we do want to use our programs as a forum to address our issues, but during COVID and during this whole summer, maybe we're all full of issues. And I feel like this program is just a different perspective on things we're all thinking about and something we may not think about very much. So it's certainly true for me. And the only other intro thing I'll just throw out there is that my husband and I have just been on a road trip with Laura, and the three of us drove to Georgia in less than a week, and we went through 12 states. So what was hysterical for me is that she's in the back seat, and I didn't hear, are we there yet? Or where are we going to stop for lunch? But over and over, I hear, whoa, nice transmission lines. Repeatedly, I hear, oh, nice transmission lines. And then a question to me that was, how do you feel about the transmission lines like we're going by now? Would you rather have them and see them on the highway where you're seeing other stuff? Or would you rather they're tucked away somewhere else and you don't have to see transmission? And that had just never occurred to me. And it was an interesting question. And it just shifted a perspective about our power and how I don't necessarily appreciate anything more than turning the light switch on and expect the lights to be there. And that dependability has been fabulous, but things are changing, and we all see that sometimes we better be thinking about where our power comes from. So plenty of introduction for Laura, and I'd like to welcome her to the program. And Laura, you can go from there. Oh, one more thing. I'll just say the questions that were submitted, all of you online, I'll run some of those when we're done, after Laura's done, and we can decide if you still have those questions, and we'll try to save those. So, yep, I'm turning it over. Off you go, Laura.
Okay, thank you very much. Very happy to be joining all of you tonight to talk about transmission and decarbonization and grid infrastructure in general. It's a pretty wonky topic, so I'm impressed by the number of people on the call, I see some familiar faces, so I can tell my mom did some good recruiting. It's good to see those of you I haven't seen in a long time. My plan just here at the outset, I've got a presentation that you see up. I'm planning to touch on just 3 pieces. One, to introduce sort of what the bulk power system means and what system operator does as a function, so that you can understand kind of where Minnesota and where Stillwater fits into that equation. The next section is just briefly discussing renewables and decarbonization trends that we're tracking. And then lastly, I'm really hoping to spend some time on the connection between decarbonization and investment in more infrastructure to support it and investment in the grid in general. So I will run through these slides. They're mostly pictures, not a lot of words. And feel free to stop me as we go with questions. And then I'm hoping just to leave a bunch of time at the end to take the conversation wherever you are most interested in taking it. All right, so a brief introduction of what a system operator is. So the picture here, I'll start in the bottom left corner with your home or the library is the end use customer or the load, if you will. Connected to the grid through individual lines, wires that you see moving around the neighborhood, smaller poles moving in and out of the city, across short distances to the substation. So everything at that level of the grid is called the distribution grid, and it's owned and operated by your utility, the person or the entity that you pay your electricity bill, manages and owns most of that infrastructure. From the substation level up to the generator is the transmission system or the bulk system. So those are the big lines, like my mom said, that I appreciate as we're on road trips. Those big lines that you see along highways when you're crossing between states, between utilities that connect ultimately connect to the generators, utility scale, big natural gas plants or wind farms or nuclear plants, hydro, et cetera. So when we're talking about the bulk system, we're talking about that high voltage electricity system. And that is all owned by somebody likely other than your utility and operated by a regional or an independent system operator. So Minnesota is part of MISO, which is where I work, the Midcontinent Independent System Operator. MISO is the largest of the system operators by geographic location. You can see the footprint here for the north, central, and south regions. I won't go into each of these stats, but to suffice it to say, it's huge, 15 states, 42 million end-use customers, of which you are likely one. If you live in this region, thousands of miles of transmission lines and huge number of generators that are all on the system that MISO operates. Beyond MISO, there are a number of other similar entities. We're all nonprofit organizations technically, and governed by or regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. So to our west is the Southwest Power Pool, and to our east is PJM and a few others. Some states you can see aren't part of a regional system operator or balancing authority. Up to them. That may change, I'm guessing, with more renewables on the system. There's more balancing needs and there may be more growth within these this function. But also say that this is the picture of the full Eastern Interconnect. So not only do we work together with our neighbors, but actually the full system of the Eastern Interconnect, the grid itself, is all connected, and all those generators are synced up with each other and moving along at the same pace and spinning at the same frequency. So if you have a sudden outage where a huge power plant suddenly goes offline for whatever reason, it'll dip in the system for a fraction of a second, and then the rest of this huge machine will pull that back up and pull the frequency back up. It's incredible. It's interconnected. It's the biggest machine that exists in the world is the power grid. So a few more detail on what MISO does. So there's really three main functions of a system operator like MISO. So the picture you see at the bottom of this slide is is what the Egan control room looks like. So MISO has 3 locations. One of them is here in Egan, Minnesota. One is in Carmel, Indiana, and one is in Little Rock, Arkansas. And this is a 2-story, it's hard to tell from this picture, but it's actually a 2-story huge monitor. Looks like something you'd see out of, a movie about a rocket launch or something to me. But it's these maps and smart alarming and information about what's going on the grid and the health of the grid in general, tons of monitoring, and we're controlling the system. So that's the operations function. It's a lot like an air traffic controller. This is a good analogy, I find. MISO doesn't own any of the transmission or any of the generation, but we're controlling it. So we're telling it when to increase output and decrease output, and we're balancing it with the real-time load on the system. So there's that piece. The whole control room function happens 24 hours a day, holidays, all the time, constantly. And then there's the market piece. So, the market is complex, but it boils down to basically, if you own a generator or something else that's contributing a service to the system, you are paid for that service. If you are a load serving entity or an end use customer and you're pulling power or any other service from the system, then you pay for it. And MISO does that settlement process on a daily basis. So we're clearing generation and bringing the least cost resources into the system, and then tracking who's using what and who's contributing what. And at the end of every day, we're pushing out a settlement number, and that's billions of dollars in transactions. As a piece of that, I don't know as much about that, but it's there. And then the planning piece has to do with both new and retiring generation. So we're doing big modeling, engineering, power system studies on new generators that are coming onto the system, and similarly studying generators as they go off the system. We are planning for transmission upgrades and outages, and ultimately moving towards some longer range transmission planning, which I'll get into later in the presentation. So what that boils down to is essentially this. You can see on MISO's real-time page all the energy mix in real time all the time. Each of the nodes on the system have a different price point. So if there's a shortage of energy, those prices will go up. If there is an abundance of energy and not a lot of use for it, you'll see those prices reach nearly 0 or go negative in some cases. And then the forecasting function is here on the right. So this is a load curve over the course of 24 hours. Midnight here, almost no load, meaning electricity use during the night. And then over, between these hours, 4 and 8 o'clock are the heaviest use of the grid for the day. And MISO system generally looks like that most days. This is the last slide in this section, which is what makes up our energy here in Minnesota. So Minnesota is part of MISO North, which, as you can see, is by far the cleanest region of the MISO footprint. So wind in April made up 53% of the electrons that ended up in your home. And if you add the nuke section here, which is the orange, together, then you're looking at about 60% carbon-free electricity in April, 50% in May. So all of the good policy work in combination with this part of the country just having incredibly strong wind resources means that our system here in Minnesota is actually very clean and getting cleaner.
Isn't that great?
Yeah. So maybe I'll pause there. Do you think, Mom, can you tell if people are raising hands, or should I keep clipping?
I saw a couple of things in the chat, but then maybe I'm almost going to say let's do the whole presentation. Oh, there it is. There's something about hacking. Can you see that in the chat?
Oh yeah, cybersecurity. Do you want me to?
Sure, go ahead. It's up.
Yeah, at a very high level, it's very security is a major piece of the MISO, the organization I work. It's certainly the most secure place I've ever worked, and I've worked for utilities as well. But yeah, the physical premise is very secure, and you know, people monitoring the building at all times. But then also on the cyber side, there are a number of hoops you have to get into the system. The actual system itself is protected by many layers, and I'm not a person within the organization that has authority to even get into those layers. And then there's, yeah, a lot of effort around standardization from FERC and NERC, which is the Reliability Council, on how to remain secure and protect yourself from cybersecurity threats. I think in general, they are, you know, it's a concern that's growing, but it's well understood, and there are a lot of checks in place.
Great, thank you.
All right, so the next portion here is about decarbonization. Yeah, so in general, this map just shows the wind and solar resources in the United States, and the awesome part for MISO is that a lot of this overlaps with our footprint. So you can see a really strong wind resources in the northern part of the US, actually some of the best in the whole world. And then the southern part of the MISO footprint, a lot of sun resource down there as well. So I'll talk a little bit more about balancing, but having access to both types of renewable generation actually makes the equation of balancing more renewables a lot simpler for MISO, because we're connected across a more diverse geography. We spend a lot of time on the market and grid strategy team tracking goals and decarbonization numbers. The base blue here is the MISO footprint, and anything you see that's green or in hash has some decarbonization target. So Minnesota, as you can see, Xcel Energy and Minnesota Power's footprint here, they both have 80% decarbonization targets, and along with the state being hashed, meaning that it's pursuing clean energy goals up to 100%. So this is something that MISO is tracking closely to understand what we're in for, to do longer range planning, to anticipate where there will be shortages on the system that we would need to fill, and to sort of take a broader look at the planning piece to make sure that Minnesota or Xcel Energy are not doing their planning in isolation, that they understand what their neighbors are doing and how to work collaboratively towards decarbonization. This is a photo of the interconnection queue. This I find to be incredibly hopeful. So the queue are the projects that are lined up to be studied and to get permission to connect to MISO's transmission system. And the yellow are solar projects, of which there are over 300. The red are battery storage projects. The orange are hybrid projects, which are mostly solar and storage combined, and the green is wind. So almost the entire pie is our carbon-free resources, with the exception of 14 gas projects, which make up a very small minority of what's being built or considered to be built right now. So this to me feels like the strongest indicator that MISO has of what's ahead. Are just the interest in and who's investing in these projects and who's moving them through the process of being studied. All of them clean resources, most. I snipped this slide earlier from a different presentation, but just to communicate mostly the evolution here. So in 2005, MISO was producing, or MISO's energy mix was made up of 76% coal. And here we are in 2020 with a sizable 13% renewable contribution, plus the 17% of carbon-free nukes. So over a third there that is carbon-free. And then a lot of the coal, as you can see, has been replaced with natural gas. And then MISO does some forward future planning stuff, but basically what this means is that We think the most conservative pace of change would amount to this pie chart by 2030, and a more aggressive future would look like this. These futures were put together under the Trump administration, and you still see very little coal by 2030. And we haven't yet rerun the future analysis for the Biden administration and the goals there. So I would expect this to continue to accelerate. There's a lot of detail here, but MISO spends a lot of time modeling and looking forward as far as what it will take to run the system reliably with higher renewable penetration. And the summary slide here is basically that at about 30% renewable, there's an inflection point where a number of issues become much harder to manage, including some grid stability and reliability issues. So all that work is well underway at MISO to prepare for that future, knowing that the 30% number is at our doorstep, basically, in the world of energy change, and a lot of interesting problems to solve, but some real complexities with what's ahead. Oops, wrong direction. But yeah, and that's my page break for that section. I'll pause there. Keep going, Mom.
Oh, sorry, I had to let the dog out. This is terrible to say that out loud. I have one question. When you talked about the resources that are being studied and MISO looks at them to bring them online, yeah. And you know, what kind of a time frame is that? Does that mean our politics? Who needs to hurry, I guess? Is that a way to put it?
Yeah, you can't tell from the slide what the time frame is as far as how far away they are from being placed in service. It's 100% likely that all 522 of these projects will not reach commercial operation. MISO is currently studying them all in various stages of the cycle, study cycle. I guess the short answer is it takes about a year or a year and a half from the time you submit an application for it to be studied by MISO and the transmission operator, and then to get contractual agreement to be able to add that generator to the system. And then it takes maybe 2 or 3 years from there to do all the necessary upgrades to the transmission in order to be able to manage that system addition and to actually construct the project itself. So that depends a lot. If it's a natural gas plant, those take 5 or 7 years to build. A solar plant could take 1 or 2. Wind is generally 2 or 3, but not. It's a long process, and these are big infrastructure projects. So it takes some time. But MISO is really working to try to bring our part of that equation, down to lessen our timelines on the interconnection side, try to get it down to just a single calendar year, which would be a lot of work, especially considering how many projects we anticipate are coming.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to keep moving just into the last section here, and then we can open it up. The takeaway is we need transmission. So the first 2 slides are talking just a little bit about renewable energy generation and the variability of that generation. So this is an example from last winter at MISO, but we had a few days in January where there was no wind for a stretch of 50 plus hours. And then a few weeks later, we experienced what was our peak at the time. We've since surpassed this peak. But this also to say, this is what the wind fleet looks like. So even though our wind generation is spread out pretty widely around the northern footprint, it's still mostly in the north. There's not a lot of wind yet in the central region or the south at all. And so when the wind is blowing a lot, we see a lot of generation from the wind fleet, and less so when it's not windy. The more we can diversify the location of these resources across a wider geographic footprint, the better. And I think with wind technology, the the newest technology is less dependent on really strong wind resources, which is great because that means that wind projects could be viable in more locations than just the windiest. But it makes sense over the last 15 years as wind has come online that those developers are looking for the windiest locations. And so often those are pretty close to one another. The sun is a little bit simpler for us to manage on the forecasting standpoint. Your iPhone can tell you when the sun is rising and when it's setting. And so that's good information to know. It's also really helpful for MISO to know that there will be no solar generation at night with 100% certainty. But this top graph shows that, just the pattern over the course of the day. But then also solar, it has the added complexity of being a much lower resource in the winter, shorter days and snow cover, cloudier in general, versus the summer months. So there's a good amount of variation across the year for that resource as well. And I'll just make this point, I failed to add it to the slides, but what MISO does is MISO needs to understand in real time the variability of the load as a base, which MISO has been doing since the beginning of the system operator, beginning of time of system operators, is to understand the variation, how much energy will be needed for every 5 minutes of every day as we move forward. We're used to forecasting that, we're used to planning for it, we're used to anticipating it. There's a ton of data that we have that we can rely on that says during these moments, this much electricity is used. It has, variability of temperature in the region, things like Super Bowl, halftime commercial break. There's always a spike in electricity during that time. People putting their Christmas lights out after Thanksgiving. You can see that bump on the energy charts as the evening sets in on the day after Thanksgiving. Things like that, we have a lot of experience doing that. So that amount of variability we're used to. When you add the variability of wind resources, it gets more complicated, it's compounding. So you have to pay attention to both the variability of the load and that generation. And now we're getting to have more solar. So we're forecasting that, trying to anticipate what it will do every 5 minutes, and anticipating that variability. And then once those three things are stacked on top of each other, our job is to run the rest of the fleet, which is called a dispatchable resources, things you can turn up and down, and let them know how to fill in the gaps of what's needed. There's very little storage currently on the system, so all of this balancing is happening really in real time for now. I added this little snippet on the bottom left. This was actually from the February cold weather event that my mom mentioned, that most of the press was on Texas during that time, but MISO actually also had some load shed or some outages related to it. And this just shows how much electricity was moving around between us and our neighbors. And this line is my favorite. There was 1.7 gigs of energy that just flowed through MISO's transmission from our east neighbor to our west neighbor. Just a lot of movement, and all of this really unusual for that challenging cold weather event. But also to say, in a high renewables future, there's a much higher need than there has been in the past to move electricity from where it's generated and where it's available and when it's available to where it's needed. So one of the major initiatives that MISO has under what we're calling the reliability imperative is a long-range transmission planning process. And this is different than what MISO has ever done in the past. Before, there was a nearer term transmission planning process where we would identify transmission that was aging or a handful of new generators that were coming online, and we would prescribe upgrades that were needed to the system to manage that. Now we're taking a step back from that and looking ahead 20 years. And the idea there is that rather than investing in all these sort of piecemeal bits of infrastructure, if we were to anticipate what's needed 20 years from now and instead build bigger infrastructure to begin with, that there's overall cost savings there. And if we can really move this really inexpensive, it's free actually, renewable energy. You don't have to pay for the fuel. if you can move this really inexpensive or free energy from where it's available to where it's needed, then that starts to pay for the transmission that's needed to move it around. And that's the underlining idea here. So the idea is somewhere the sun is shining, somewhere the wind is blowing, and the interconnectivity and the balancing and being able to help each other out across the full continent, or at least across the full US, is really what's needed for huge decarbonization goals. So MISO is in the middle, as I said, of this long-range transmission planning effort. It's a huge effort with tons of really smart engineers locked in a room trying to figure this out. The picture you see here is kind of the more conservative future, what we think we'll need for transmission versus the more aggressive future, which includes more renewables, but it also includes electrification, anticipating that a number of the things we use now that we rely on fossils or natural gas for outside of electricity, we would convert those things to electricity and therefore need more electricity. So these are just indicative lines at this point, but that's good work that's underway at MISO. And then Governor Walz just this month, with 3 other governors, submitted a letter of support to cheer MISO on for this effort, which is massive and challenging. Bigger picture, outside of MISO, there's also a growing body of work that shows that this macrogrid concept, more interconnectivity, big transmission investment, is really the least expensive path to decarbonization. I won't go into all of these. There's some variation between studies, but this one shows just huge flows across the full US, where the sun rises on one side of the country and starts moving power, and then tracks across the country and starts moving power in the other direction. But that's all really needed in order to ensure that we have reliability on the system all the time. And this is my last slide. I just threw up the headlines that I've been seeing even just this week about infrastructure investment and grids and getting power to where it's needed. And it's been super interesting to me that this is becoming part of the media and part of the conversation, that people are interested in grids, and that this infrastructure package, but also the event in Texas, the California event with some outages last summer, that this is just bringing more understanding of the reliance on the electricity sector and the grid, and what's really needed as far as investment to make sure that we're on top of these changes and we're prepared for what's ahead with decarbonization. That's the end. This cornfield picture of a transmission. It's a nice looking transmission line.
Well, thank you, Laura. I feel like I had to listen fast to let it sink in everything that you were trying to say about the complexity. And I've listened before to what you had to say. So I'm going to guess that there are some questions. I think I'll ask a couple of the questions that were submitted initially in the program. We'll start with that. And those of you listening, if you want to put a question in the chat, we'll go there next so that we get, we'll try to cover as many questions as we can. So the first one submitted is there a possibility that Minnesota will have the same power outage problems that Texas did?
Well, yes, I think there's a possibility. The advantage that Minnesota has is that it's connected to a much wider footprint across the whole Eastern Interconnect. So during that same cold weather snap, we had a lot of help from our neighbors. And Texas is not. Texas has a system operator that's called ERCOT, but they are isolated to their own sort of microgrid for the state of Texas for a lot of reasons. Energy independence from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission being the main reason for their isolation down there. So we have, I think what we're learning with more decarbonization and more variable resources is that interconnection across the wider footprint is hugely advantageous. But that is also true of more extreme events. So with climate change, there will be more frequency of hurricanes and storms and extreme hot, extreme cold, and the grid infrastructure and its connectivity is a big part of how you would solve for those situations. So I think we're in better shape than Texas.
Good to
Also,
hear.
I will add to that just about winterization. So one of the things that that the resources and the generators down in Texas did not have were winterization packages and things like that. They basically, because there are so few cold days in Texas, there wasn't a lot of financial motivation to make sure that the generator could ride through some of those extreme temperatures. So we have that winterization much more so up in this part of the country where that cold weather is expected. So most of the generators that are in Minnesota, for example, can run to negative 30-degree temperatures and are prepared to do that. So that investment in our infrastructure has been made up here because we are, we're prepared to see that more frequently, so that the Texas infrastructure is not as well suited for that extreme cold.
Okay, great. Well, I appreciate the succinctness of your answers because I have a long list here and we might have more questions. When do you expect solar and wind energy to represent 50% of the total energy in the US?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, and here's why. If we were to move forward with decarbonizing the grid without also electrifying anything, then we would get there much faster. What is happening and what needs to happen from a climate standpoint is not only that we're decarbonizing the electrons that are on the grid, but that we're shifting everything that's not fueled by electricity to that lower carbon fuel source. So my hope is that 50% renewables is a little bit further out because we're seeing so much electrification of vehicles and buildings and cooking and heating and those things that are currently relying on fossils. The electricity grid, as I showed in one of those slides here in Minnesota, is also is already pretty clean, past that 50% number. And so, Minnesota policy and some of the, climate advocates in this area are seeing that and shifting to electrification efforts. So let's stop, burning fuels in our individual appliances and cars and stuff, move it into the electric sector in order to take advantage of the decarbonization that's there just in that fuel switching.
So a question has been tossed into the chat that's related to this. So let's hop over there. Can you see that? I'll read it. What kind of energy grid expansion would be required if the electric, automotive use and heating and AC in the US increased to 70% of the use?
Yeah, a lot.
A lot.
Yeah. I think so. Electric vehicle infrastructure is, kind of has its own challenges, but that's mostly at the distribution level. At the transmission level, that's mostly just going to look like increase of electrical load. Some of that is especially exciting, actually, and could bring some efficiencies to the system because you could potentially control that load. You could move it around. So, for example, if you had an electric vehicle and you had a time of use rate from your utility could encourage you to charge that vehicle overnight when you're not otherwise using energy, rather than over those peak times, in which case there wouldn't be any new need for the grid. So the sort of smoothing of the load could bring a lot of efficiencies. And there are, there's a lot of thinking around just controllable load and whether MISO would at some point serve a function where we're turning on and off load in addition to turning on and off generation in order to really smooth that. So just adding all of those things doesn't necessarily translate to huge infrastructure investment, but we're starting in kind of a bit of a deficit. You know, the grid already is old and aging. And so really to move forward at all, even an incremental step, we need some major investment.
Okay. I guess I'm going to take one question sort of generally from the one submitted and summarize it to say basically it's what can one person do? If you can't put solar panels on your house because it's all in shade, then how do we support this movement? And overall, what do we do as individuals? It's a small question, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I love this question because it comes from, you know, it's an overwhelming problem that we're facing with climate change, and it is hard to think that an individual could make a difference. I'll say from my perspective that, you know, I'm a huge believer in individual contribution, and, you know, just every step that I take for my household and my family to work to lessen my footprint just feels good. And, you know, getting involved feels good, and making changes feels good. Certainly you know, voting for people who are championing renewables, you know, making your voice heard through your electricity provider, and participating in programs that they may offer for a wind source or other things. But also I think, you know, if you're in Minnesota and, you know, we already have a utility here in Xcel Energy that's making big decarbonization commitments, you know, probably the biggest things we can do is the fuel switching piece. And to, you know, think about next time your hot water heater stops working, to buy an electric one instead. There's a lot of buying power in that, not only for the energy contribution, but because, you know, with pioneering new technologies, investing in those technologies makes it less expensive for the next person, and, you know, brings more of it to, you know, your local stores or your car dealers, and, you know, those sort of ripple effects I think are still important. Put your money where your mouth is. But that's also, you know, of course, much too limited of a view. We're in a situation now where we need huge scale and huge pace. And that's really has to come from policy level, has to come from big commitments, clearing the way for simpler transactions and incentives, and, you know, moving the way forward, you know, at a big scale, huge pace. So all of the above. I'm a believer in all of the above.
Okay, so I see two more in the chat. Are the rest of you on this call willing to put things in the chat if you have more questions? I'll head for these two. We did the hacking. Is lower efficiency significant when transmitting electricity long distances?
Lower efficiency?
Yeah, that's what it says.
It could be, that could be a high voltage question, so I'll answer it that way. A lot of these studies that are advocating for a macrogrid, including connecting the Eastern Interconnect to the Western Interconnect, for example, a lot of those studies do spit out what's called a high voltage DC transmission line. And there are a lot of efficiencies in DC versus AC, but also high voltage in moving power efficiently across the transmission system, which just means you would have fewer losses in heat and other things as the electrons move across a wire. So yeah, when we're talking about traveling across an entire continent, for example, then what you're looking at there is a high voltage DC transmission line investment. And there aren't a lot of DC lines in this region, actually. There is one that comes in to Minnesota from North Dakota, directly from Coal Creek, actually. And the DC line has a lot of advantages. It's kind of operational or operatable. You can control the generation or the energy as it moves across the line. The technology is really cool and kind of new. But yeah, the actual grid investment piece, I don't think it will be a matter of replacing what we have today. There's a lot of interesting technologies out there to make grids smarter and more efficient, to give you more visibility on what power is flowing. If there's instability on the grid, little gadgets that will boost that power and clean it up as it moves along. All sorts of really cool transmission technologies out there that everyone's kind of trying to get their heads around and figure out how to advance in the space.
Great. Okay, so two people are interested in the same question, so let's go there. What is the relationship between MISO and the independent power companies?
Oh yeah, okay. So the relationship is the same as the utilities that own generation. There's kind of two different categories of generators. A lot of utilities, because we mostly have regulated utilities in this part of the country, they are regulated by a Public Utilities Commission and they own their own generation. There are also deregulated utilities where the utility doesn't own any of its own generation. There are advantages, disadvantages of both. But then there's also an independent power producers, and those would just be non-utilities that own generators. We have the same relationship with them. They have a trading desk at MISO, and they're participating in the market, bidding in what generation they have. You know, we're operating those plants in the same way that we would any other plants. And then those settlements go to the independent power producer. A lot of them have sort of bilateral agreements with utilities as kind of purchase power agreements, that sort of thing. That's all boring, but same relationship.
Okay. Any more questions? Are there solar incentives for homeowners being planned at the federal or state level?
Yes, both. The federal government has extended the solar tax credit, which applies to all projects, no matter the size, residential included. So if you are installing solar on your home, you can get a tax credit for that. It was meant to expire a couple years from now, and they've extended it. Oh, actually, it was meant to step down from some number to a lower number, and they extended it without the step down, I think. I'm not remembering the exact detail of the tax credit, but yes, there's a federal tax credit. And then, yeah, depending where you live, if you're an Xcel Energy customer, there's also a solar rewards program with Xcel, and they're looking to buy the renewable energy credit from you, and they will pay you based on the production of your system on your roof. So that's another incentive. And then there's even some more that are local beyond that. Minneapolis, I know, has a very specific neighborhood by neighborhood incentive program where they're trying to help businesses kind of in lower income neighborhoods throughout the city put solar on their businesses or their commercial buildings. So yeah, there are many layers. The best way to find out probably is to call a solar installer and ask for a quote, and they'll walk you through the layers of incentives that would be available to you.
All right. Well, I don't have too many more questions. I think I think some of these we kind of talked about. Oh, there's a question about battery storage.
Oh, nice.
What's the thing with battery storage? That's what we all hear about as being problematic. Huh?
Yeah, batteries are super interesting right now. Sometimes I'm tempted to quit my job and go figure out how to work in the battery space. At a high level, the cost of batteries are coming down significantly. But there's a lot of competition on the supply chain side for batteries, given electrification of more gadgets and vehicles and things. MISO is seeing pretty solid interest from our developers and members on interconnecting storage to the transmission system. Mostly it's coming in the form of hybrid projects. So it's actually solar projects that are paired in the same location with a battery, which has a lot of advantages. You can charge the battery with the solar, and then you can bid it into the market when the costs are the highest throughout the day, which are generally after early evening hours, or after your solar resources kind of started to sunset in the afternoon. We are seeing some standalone storage projects as alternative to transmission investment. So rather than investing X amount in a new transmission line, you can place a storage project on there that solves your same problem for less. Overall, the idea of being able to store energy is really exciting. Like I said, all of the energy balancing happens in real time currently. We have very little storage capability on the system. We do have a few pumped hydro projects up in Canada, but those are pretty limited from an environmental regulation standpoint. But yeah, it's very pioneering. I agree with you. I hear about it everywhere also. We don't yet really know what it can do and how much of it to expect to come online. But it certainly has potential. I think, you know, a lot of the big decarbonization studies that are happening, you can get to about 80% with renewable investment and transmission. And that last 20 or even 10% becomes complicated unless you have a way to store energy across even multiple days, which just seems to be the real trick.
Okay, so I just grabbed my phone. We have a question about Texas. I'll read that one through. We have maybe 10 minutes more, and then we've spent our hour and a half thinking hard about a complicated subject. So this from one of the people sitting in our midst. I'm not sure I understand the situation in Texas. Are they a standalone grid on their own choosing, or are they there other extenuating circumstances? And was the failure in part caused by the failure of renewables to serve their role as a backup, as some of the politicians seemed to want to say? And I'm going to add, we also heard that in California, that it was the renewables that failed, right? And can you address that for us?
Yeah, I sure can. So the first part about being an isolated grid, that is by Texas's choosing. Texas, of course, being a longtime leader and major energy producer, and also just a generally independent state on a lot of, in a lot of ways, not just in the energy way. So there, basically, if you have a transmission grid that is multi-state, then you become subject to the regulation of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And so Texas has, FERC does have some jurisdiction over a few pieces. The cybersecurity piece is a good example, and some of the reliability pieces. But for the most part, Texas is has chosen to own and produce and operate their own grid within the state of Texas, without connectivity across the borders. They do have one line down to Mexico, from what I understand, but I don't know too much about that. And then on the renewable side, yeah, it's hard because the news cycle is fast and reliability challenges are super complicated. So for example, on the February cold weather event in Texas and that MISO experienced, MISO only just published our white paper about what happened and the reasons for the load shed during that February event just this last month in May. And it does really take that long to document and pull data and understand all of the many, many, many factors that play out during those extreme events. There are decisions that are made every second in the control room. There's generators that come up and off and on. There are prices in play. There are balancing needs of the system at play. And so the news cycle is almost always wrong, but certainly always guessing at what is going on. And that's the case with Texas as well. And, you know, there's of course all the political layers that play into that as well, with the finger pointing and all of that. So the Texas situation, they have produced their full report on what happened and what the causes were. There was the winterization impact of the wind turbines that I talked about a little bit earlier. Basically, those turbines didn't have winterization packages like the ones we have up here in Minnesota. And so when those cold climates hit, then the inverters stopped working, kind of went into sort of standby mode in order to protect itself from the extreme event. And so they did have less wind show up than they had forecasted for those days. But that was also true of their natural gas generation. They had coal piles that froze. They had challenges with their nukes, all of it. So just in general, like really extreme temperatures are hard on these generators. They're machines with moving parts and electronics and all the rest. And so they always, you know, underperform during those extremes, and sometimes they can't perform at all. Yeah, and the California, to touch on that event, the load that was shed, or the blackouts that started in California, happened at the same time as the sun was setting. So you could say that solar was to blame, but as a system operator, my perspective is that California ISO, their system operator, knew exactly when the sun was going to set. They know every day, and they planned for that solar to be decreasing and eventually offline. And so they had some other challenges where they couldn't get some of the non-solar resources to ramp up quickly enough. It was also a really widespread heat wave, which affected not only California, but also Nevada and some of their neighbors even to the north. And so during heat waves, California relies a lot on their neighbors who may not be experiencing that same heat to provide them excess energy. And in that last summer with the extreme heat wave, it was so widespread that their neighbors were needing to keep all of the generation to serve their own load and didn't have any to share. So yeah, it's all very complicated. Reliability is it's challenging, and whenever there's a blackout or a load shed event, that's always absolutely the last resort. But it's also an important tool that the transmission system operator has in order to keep the overall system up and stable, is to reduce some of that load during those extreme times.
All right. Any other questions before we get back to our regular thinking? Turn a few lights off, or air conditioners, whatever. Anything anyone else wants to ask? Jim?
Can you hear me, Karen, Hannah?
I can hear you.
There's a question that came up about likelihood of hacking into the system.
Yeah.
What kind of protection do we have against hacking?
Yeah, that's not my area of expertise. I know from my own experience as an employee of MISO that there are a number of precautions in place. You know, when I go to the office, which I don't currently, but when I did, you know, I would have to badge through 3 separate doors in order to get to my desk. There's a lot of building security stuff. But then, I was just working through a contract with an outside consultant, and they needed access to some of MISO's data. And it took, I don't know, it took me like 3 months or something in order to ultimately get approval to share this data with somebody outside of MISO. So there are a lot of protections in place. There's a lot of precaution. We as employees are put through security related training on a regular basis. But I do think that, that the risk is out there, and it's probably on the rise given all of the technology and new types of technology that are needed to keep the system running. So it's something to be aware of. Personally, with my vantage point, it's not something that keeps me up at night.
You're a believer.
Any other questions? Feel free to speak up. Well, thank you, Laura, for giving us a new perspective. That's what is our goal tonight, and something we will be more aware of in the realm of our energy use.
Did you get that? I'm unmuted. Hi, I have a question for Laura.
Okay, sorry.
I'm a mom, and I'm just curious how she got into this business and what her degree is in. As my daughter was calling me from another state on the phone that my husband got. Yeah, if you heard that ringing.
That's funny. My degree is in physics and math. And I attempted to take a power systems graduate program at St. Thomas recently, but did not complete it, or have not completed it yet. I got into it, actually just coincidentally ended up moving to Boulder right when their renewable portfolio standard was passed in Colorado, and a bunch of new residential solar installers were popping up everywhere. And I worked for a solar installer, rooftop residential installers where I started. And then from there, I moved to California, worked for Solar City, which was a more national company, mostly doing rooftop, but I started doing other more commercial projects. The interconnection piece, or the sort of utility interface, was always what I thought to be the most interesting challenge there. I worked for a utility for a while, PG&E in California, moved back to Minnesota, and I worked for a policy organization. I worked for a couple other larger scale developers, and then found myself intrigued by the transmission system and big energy markets, and sort of the pace and scale of what's needed from a climate standpoint. So I've been at MISO now for a couple of years.
Thank you. That's all I needed to know. I just like to know how people.
Yeah, and actually let her know that my first ever job in solar, I took hanging door hangers. You know those obnoxious door hangers that they put on your doorknob? I was paid to walk around wealthy neighborhoods and look for roofs that had good solar access, no shade, no vents, on south-facing roof. And then I would write a little note on this door hanger that said, "Your house is great for solar, give us a call," and then hang it on their door. That's my first ever
Okay,
job in
thanks.
energy.
That's really.
Did you have any luck?
I have to run. It sounds like it was really a great presentation. Thank you. I appreciated it.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
Laura. You have great expertise, and I admire your enthusiasm. And so I feel like we're in good hands. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I don't know that I had any luck. And I really didn't like the job because it felt really invasive to be walking up to people's houses and like looking at their roofs, and dogs would bark at me and stuff. I didn't do it for very long.
Well, again, people, all of you who joined us tonight, thank you for coming to one of our programs. Be aware that we have all kinds of interesting things this summer for adults and kids at the library. We will send a follow-up email with input about our programs, but we hope this has been something that's just good community discussion for all of us, regardless of where we live. Thanks for joining us tonight. I think we're basically
Thank
wrapping.
you, thank you,
For
thank you.
hosting. That's great.
Thank you.
Thanks, kiddo.
Great. Very good.
Thanks.
Just gonna stand to read the chat now that I can see it.
That must be Jody's.
All right, Mom.
Okay,
We
thanks,
did it.
kiddo.
We did it.